film was released in 2007. Do we know how things have changed since then?
Well, we're growing more corn. We're up to about 350 or 360 million. Million tons. Yeah.
So the trends have continued.
Yeah, it just keeps increasing.
I think we're also now exporting an enormous amount of high fructose corn syrup just as because it's going into foods in lots of other countries now. I would just mention that the first time I saw this film was at Manchester College, which is up near Fort Wayne, and the Farm Bureau sent someone to the viewing to give the other side. And is there anybody here from the Farm Bureau tonight who wants to give the other side? No, I guess not. Yeah.
Another question. They talked about grain-fed versus grass-fed cattle. Is it possible to buy grass-fed beef in Bloomington?
Mandy Corey runs a farm down on Schacht Road, right next to the Speedway. And she has a CSA, and regularly, every month you get a delivery or you go and pick up. And there are several other vendors at the farmers market who will sell you grass-fed beef.
But not at a supermarket.
Blooming Foods. And Sahara Mart.
And I think you can get grass-fed buffalo at Farm, Bloomington.
Just a very quick question. Can we witness a similar trend for other kind of crops, such as soybean or soy? Sorry.
Soy is also kind of an anti-nutrient. It blocks the absorption of other nutrients when it's not fermented. So eating a lot of soy, which I imagine is part of that other 40% of the cattle feed is soy, isn't nutritious. It's empty calories, adverse metabolic implications. And then if you consider the vast monoculture method that we use to grow soy, it produces the same issues that we have with corn, the use of excessive fertilizers and so forth.
If you think of corn as the industrial producer of starch and carbohydrate, soybeans are the industrial production of protein. And soy lecithin works its way into almost as many foods as corn oil or high fructose corn syrup. It's fed to a lot of animals, and it's made into an incredible range of products, including ink. So once you have a cheap, complex carbohydrate or protein on the market, people find all kinds of ways to use it.
So I had both a question and a sort of answer maybe to the question, or at least from what I caught from the film. I think he said about a third went to feeding cattle or ethanol, and about 60%, and again, this is from his Iowa farm, right? It could be different, was for the corn syrup. So that my question though is, jumping off of the earlier question about grass-fed versus corn-fed beef, I'm wondering if either of you knows, in terms of the acreage of corn versus or the acreage of grass. I mean, how much land is required in terms of what's the difference between grass-fed and corn-fed cows?
Yeah, I can't say exact acreage. Of course, it's more acreage for grass-fed, but you also can use that land for other purposes. So I think Joel Salatin shows us a great example of how you can make more of that acreage while grass feeding your cattle.
Also, it's interesting, beef consumption in the United States has been going down for about the last 15 years on a per capita basis. We're just eating less beef and a lot more chicken. So chicken's gone up, beef's gone down, fish is going down slightly. So we're kind of switching from red to white. I think pork consumption is also held a bit, about steady. And also something a lot of people don't know, the obesity rate kind of topped out in 2010, I believe, and it's kind of dipped a little bit since then in the U.S.
I'm not one from the Farm Bureau, so I wouldn't know the other side of the story. What is it?
The one part of the other side is that farmers themselves are kind of an endangered species, and they consider themselves to be much maligned, when all they're trying to do is to give people what they want, which is cheap food, sweet food, and convenient forms of getting it into their bodies, convenient ways to get it into their bodies. I think the average age of American farmers is going up towards 60 now, and there's still a lot of flight from rural areas into urban areas. A lot of small towns are just abandoned now. So they feel like people just don't understand that they don't control the prices and they don't control the chemical demands. They just, from their point of view, are trying to do it in the most efficient possible way.
So how do you feel? Is it about supply or the demand? What is the
Sorry?
drive? Is it about supply or is it about the demand? What is the driving force?
Yeah, I think it's. I think they kind of are in a very close relationship with each other, and it's very unlikely that farmers are going to cut back as long as the subsidy system remains the way it is.
Can I have one more question because you mentioned subsidies? How well are the American public aware of this subsidy system? Because, you probably noticed that I have an accent. I'm not American. My basic understanding is that people would be opposed to it, subsidizing any kind of production.
Yeah, the thing about the subsidy program is it's part of the Farm Bill, which the one that just came out in January was almost 1,000 pages. It's very complicated. It's an omnibus bill that covers everything from commodities to conservation to nutrition and food stamps. So it's quite impossible for any one person to really understand it fully. It takes a large joint effort. And the fact that we do have so few farmers, I think that voice definitely gets lost. They're the ones that actually interact, with the Farm Bureau and do all the paperwork, and we have no idea.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Wilk, and hello, the other person. Hey, that's a really disturbing movie, and I wonder if anybody in the audience still buys food that has corn syrup in it. Does anybody still do that? I mean, this was out in 2005, 2007. Really? Huh, that's amazing to me. On one thing, I'd like to ask you, this exporting to other countries of this food, because my daughter just got back from Germany and said there's a big movement there against GMO products. And it's that other countries, do they have the right to refuse our goods? Like, for example, Mexico with NAFTA, wasn't that one of the whole reasons for NAFTA so we could export this food to Mexico. And taking a step further, in the Ukraine, there was a big movement against GMO foods. But of course, now that we've installed a government that's sympathetic to our needs and to our corporations' needs, they're beginning to flood the country with GMO foods. So, I mean, this isn't just about what we eat. This is a foreign policy. Can you speak on that?
Me. Well, there's a lot of popular opposition to GMO foods, not just in Europe, but in many places around the world, and increasingly here in the United States. There's been attempts in a number of states to pass laws that would require labeling of GMO foods. I don't think a lot of people know how much they're eating genetically modified crops. The science is still ambivalent about its environmental effects. We're certainly seeing a lot of changes, but we don't really know how precisely cause and effect is involved, and climate change going on at the same time. But the United States is bringing a great deal of pressure through the World Trade Organization, and also, as you said, in these bilateral and regional agreements, to try to force our consumer products on other countries and our agricultural technology on other countries. And, you know, for a small country that's desperately in need of food aid, saying no to free GMO corn is really difficult. Zambia did it back in 2005, but their government was deeply unpopular after they kind of kept the U.S. GMO corn out. There's also an issue of just to what degree we destroy the agricultural systems of other countries by subsidizing our own crops and making them much cheaper than what farmers can produce at in those countries. So in Haiti, for instance, they used to be self-sufficient in rice, but then they started importing much cheaper American rice as part of an aid package. And it put a lot of farmers out of business in Haiti and made them more dependent.
I have what I think is one maybe easier question than one that's more complicated. And one is, so we've heard a lot about the high fructose corn syrup. I think a lot of people try to avoid it. This film was 2007, but there still is corn syrup because a lot of people have shifted away from the high fructose corn syrup. And is that really any better? is I guess the question from both a physical health and environmental standpoint. And then, so high fructose corn syrup versus just corn syrup. And then secondly, I think when you were talking about there's not that many farmers and the farm bill is really, really incredibly difficult to understand. I think with regard to the farm subsidies, it's very clear that they would not be, they wouldn't know what to do without the farm subsidies. And yet it's also very clear that the farm subsidies are causing a lot of the problems. So it seems like there's a conflict between the short-term interests and the long-term interests of farmers. And I guess I was just wondering your thoughts on that and how to balance those things in the complicated landscape of modern agriculture.
All right. Well, I'm not sure about the first one. High fructose, obviously, it's got a higher sugar content. So I imagine it's a little more unhealthy, but at the same time, when corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup is in every processed food that you have, it's still a problem either way. About the subsidies, yeah, I mean, what happens is these farmers get trapped. They have to make these investments. They have to depend on the subsidy payments in order to survive, in order to continue farming the next year. And so it's hard to see a way out, for sure. I think changing our subsidy system is probably the biggest, most monumental thing we could do to change the food system as a whole. And that's going to take a lot of careful maneuvering, shifting of subsidies to more specialty crops so that these farmers have another option. They can grow other items and still be protected financially. And also having more money or funds in the Farm Bill for rural development and restoration.
In research on something other than making corn grow more densely and getting a higher yield, there's very little agricultural research done in this country that is not financed by agribusiness in one way or another. And very little of it helps small farmers or deals with non-commodity crops. So we're essentially subsidizing the creation of the illnesses that we then have to pay for. And that goes back to your first question, illnesses, because I recently became diabetic and started looking very closely at the labels of food. And these days, sugar is concealed in a lot of different ways. Not just, high fructose corn syrup is really easy to spot, but there's things like rice sweeteners, and there's agave. And if you're looking at sugars, honey is still a sugar, and it's full of, and it's not necessarily good for you to have too much. So I think my students found 9 different names for sugar last year when they went to the local marsh to see what they could find.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the implications of waste in all this process. And I know they said something in the film like the cattle field that produced the same amount of waste as a city of 1.7 million people in a year, or something like that. Do you guys know anything about the waste of whether it's the cattle or the machinery that goes into this, or do you have any knowledge of that or the implications of that?
Yeah, we have a huge problem with waste. We have closer to 50% of food produced in the U.S. wasted. But specifically on these confined farming operations, you've taken the cattle off of the land where they would naturally be fertilizing the soil with their waste. And instead, their waste is pooled into these lagoons where they're too concentrated and too toxic to be used as fertilizer anymore. So then we have to bring in our synthetic fertilizer in order to fix the problem. So we have this toxic waste that's produced, that's a waste of fertilizer, and then the synthetic fertilizer polluting the water. And there's so much waste. I don't know how detailed you want me to get with it, but
it's really kind of ironic that this is a system that's aiming for efficiency, yet it produces so much waste. And a lot of that is an accounting trick, essentially, that dumps the cost of the waste on the public, so that we end up paying for cleaning up the river when the pig lagoon gets flooded in the spring. So there's a lot of waste ends up outside of the farm system and outside of the farm economy. It's another form of subsidy, really.
Is there any danger in the industrialization of agriculture of the problem of monocultures, of the reduction of the diversity of genetic stock? And does this affect corn and other products of this sort? Or are we growing more and more of one kind of genetic composition?
Yes. The other side of that is that we're also giving so much antibiotics to animals. I think it's way more than 60% of the antibiotics are now being fed to animals. What that's doing is it's breeding resistant strains, which are going to come back on us in some pretty unpleasant ways. And a lot of people know this. It's pretty common knowledge, but getting, and there are a few states that are trying to control the use of antibiotics in feed. But so far, I'd say it's more dangerous than the reduced genetic diversity of the plants we're growing, except for oranges and bananas, which are in serious trouble.
Yeah, and we're losing species of crops that would perform better in different climates. Instead, we're trying to grow the same, what is it, the yellow den, everywhere. Where especially once we see the climate changing in the Midwest, we only have a handful of crops that better be resistant or we're in trouble. So.
The Mayan farmers I worked with in Central America in the 80s grew 9 varieties of corn in their fields in the course of a year. And just since then, it's been reduced to about 3 varieties because hybrid seed just really does outbear all the others. And they're not eating very much of the corn themselves anymore, so the taste really doesn't matter.
Back to the question of subsidies, it seems to me that Iowa has a stranglehold on the politics of subsidies. I don't think either major political party could have a presidential candidate survive the Iowa caucuses if they propose to reduce the subsidies to corn. Is that a correct analysis? And the Iowa caucuses have taken on an disproportional publicity in terms of winnowing through the presidential candidates.
It's a problem throughout our system, actually, because we have lots of big empty states with the same number of senators as densely packed states. And, the framers of the Constitution saw that as actually as a way of protecting farmers and agrarian policy as much as anything else. I'd say as the food industry gets more and more consolidated, it also increases the power of lobbyists and the influence of money on elections, money coming from companies that have a direct interest in the outcome of legislation.
So unfortunately, I have to stop us here. We're out of time. I want to thank you so much for staying. I hope you enjoyed the film. I want to thank our speakers as well who are here with us tonight. I encourage you to check out the rest of the cinema showings going on throughout the semester. And please take care getting home tonight. Thank you so much.